The drill instructor's voice hit the barracks like a pressure wave at 4:30, and Kira Vasquez was already awake. She had been awake for 11 minutes, lying on the narrow alloy rack with her hands folded across her sternum, staring at the ceiling where the station's bioluminescent panels cycled through the Torvani night spectrum. A deep indigo that was supposed to simulate restful dark, but just made everything look like the inside of a bruise. She had learned in the first week that the Torvani sleep cycle ran 6 hours longer than a human's. The barracks lights dimmed at what her body said was mid-afternoon, and the wake-up call came when her internal clock had already been ticking for almost an hour, heart rate climbing, cortisol building, her nervous system winding toward a readiness that had no outlet until the overhead speakers cracked open and Senior Instructor Dave's voice filled every cubic centimeter of breathable air. Formation parade deck, 4 minutes. Around her, 53 alien cadets lurched into motion. The Torvani, tall, heavy-boned, with skin like wet granite and 3-fingered hands broad enough to palm a human head, rolled from their racks with the grinding efficiency of industrial machinery. The Solen, thin and translucent with visible circulatory networks pulsing green beneath their skin, unfolded from sleep cocoons they had secreted during the night. The Drekari, compact and scaled, dropped from upper racks without looking, landing in synchronized crouches that made the deck plates ring. Kira swung her legs off the rack, pulled on her boots, and tied them. The uniform was standard combined academy issue, adjusted for Terran anatomy by someone who had clearly worked from a schematic rather than a fitting. The shoulders were too wide by 2 centimeters. The collar sat wrong against her neck. The boots were fleet standard, designed for the flat, smooth corridors of Torvani architecture, which meant they had no arch support, and the tread pattern was optimized for polished stone, not the kind of broken ground a human foot expected. She had filed down the interior heel with a maintenance tool she had borrowed and not returned during the first week. Nobody had noticed, or nobody had cared. She was the only human at Korath Prime Combined Military Academy. She had been the only human for 14 weeks, and she had stopped counting the days because counting implied that the days would end, and nothing about Korath Prime suggested endings. It suggested endurance. It suggested that the institution would outlast whatever you brought to it, and the only question was whether you would still be standing when it finished grinding. The parade deck was a slab of polished volcanic glass 300 meters across, open to the sky of Korath Prime's northern plateau. The sky was always the color of old copper, a permanent haze from the planet's sulfur vents that filtered the light of a white dwarf star into something that looked like a perpetual, exhausted sunset. The air was breathable but dense, thick with particulates that caught in the throat if you inhaled too fast. Kira had learned to breathe in through her nose and out through her mouth, slow and measured, the way her mother had taught her during wildfire seasons in the Central Valley, when the air quality index hit numbers that made the news anchors nervous. Dave was already on the deck when the cadets formed up. The senior instructor was Torvani, 8 feet of dense muscle and calcium deposit armor plating, with a face that was mostly jaw and a voice that carried across 300 meters of open ground without amplification. His species communicated partially through subsonic vibration, which meant that when he spoke at normal volume, the words hit your chest before they reached your ears. Kira had felt her sternum rattle during the first formation address. She did not rattle anymore. Her body had adapted the way human bodies always adapted, quietly, without permission, without asking if it was supposed to. Cohort 7, Dave said. The words landed like dropped anvils. 14 weeks. 109 days, you arrived as 62, you are now 54. The 8 who are not here failed to meet the minimum standard for continued enrollment. They are gone. Their names have been removed from the registry. We do not speak of cadets who do not finish. He paused. The silence on the parade deck was absolute. 54 species of respiratory system held still. Today begins the crucible. The word moved through the formation the way voltage moves through wire, fast, invisible and felt in the joints. The Torvani cadets locked their jaws, a reflex that sealed their grinding plates against the subsonic tremor of stress. The Solen dimmed, their green circulatory glow fading toward a pale, anxious yellow. A Drekari cadet 3 rows ahead of Kira dropped one knee half an inch, a flinch quickly corrected, but Kira saw it. She knew what the crucible was. Every cadet knew. It was the centerpiece of the Koreth Prime curriculum, a 72-hour continuous evaluation that tested combat, endurance, tactical reasoning, and what the Academy's training manual called integrity of function under sustained degradation. The washout rate was 41%. It was designed by Torvani military psychologists who believed that the only valid measure of a soldier's worth was what remained when everything had been stripped away: sleep, food, certainty, the ability to predict what came next. You entered the crucible as a cadet. You came out as an officer candidate, or you came out as nothing. Kira had read the manual entry 6 times. She had memorized the historical pass rates by species. Torvani, 71%, Drekari, 68%, Solen, 52%. No human had ever attempted the crucible at Koreth Prime because no human had ever attended Koreth Prime. The entry in the manual for Terran performance projections was a single line: insufficient data. She stood in formation with her hands at her sides, her face level, and thought about nothing at all. Not about the crucible. Not about the 14 weeks of drills, classroom evaluations, physical conditioning, and systematic pressure that had led to this moment. Not about the 8 cadets who had already washed out, 2 of them Solen who had simply stopped eating during week 9 and had to be carried to medical when their circulatory systems began shutting down. Not about the fact that she was 23 years old, 5'6", 138 pounds, and standing in a formation of beings who outmassed her by a factor of 2 to 4, on a planet that smelled like sulfur and tasted like rust, 14,000 light-years from the town in California, where she had learned to tie knots and split wood and dress a deer and keep her mouth shut when adults were talking. She thought about nothing because thinking was a luxury, and luxury was the first thing the crucible would take. Dave's jaw plates ground once, the Torvani equivalent of clearing a throat. Phase 1 begins at 600. You will receive your assignments in your cohort channels. Dismissed. The formation broke. Cadets moved in species clusters toward their barracks bays, the Torvani in heavy, deliberate groups, the Solen drifting in translucent pairs, the Drekari cutting through the crowd in tight files. Kira walked alone. She had always walked alone at Koreth Prime, not because she chose isolation. She had tried in the first weeks to integrate into study groups, to share mess hall tables, to offer the kind of easy, low-stakes camaraderie that humans defaulted to in unfamiliar environments. It had not worked. The Torvani regarded her with a polite confusion that bordered on pity. The Solen avoided her because human body temperature, a furnace by their standards, disrupted their dermal sensor arrays at close range. The Drekari simply did not acknowledge her existence unless training required it. She was not disliked. She was uncategorized, and at Koreth Prime, uncategorized meant invisible. Her cohort channel buzzed at 5:47. The assignment loaded on her wrist display in Torvani administrative script, which she had learned to read at functional speed by week 4, because the Academy did not offer translations, and because asking for one was the fastest way to confirm every assumption the institution had about human cognitive limitations. Crucible Phase 1, Cohort 7. Assignment: Combat Evaluation Individual. Location: Training Complex Ether 3. Duration: 6 hours 0600-1200. Scoring: Cumulative. No minimum threshold for Phase 1. Note: environmental conditions will be adjusted to species-neutral baseline. Species-neutral baseline. Kira knew what that meant. It meant the Torvani engineers had split the difference between every species' optimal operating range and landed on conditions that were comfortable for nobody. Temperature: 12 degrees Celsius, too cold for the Solen, too warm for the Drekari, and fine for a human who had grown up where nights dropped to single digits in November. Gravity: 1.1 standard, which was Korath Prime's natural pull, heavier than Earth's 1 but lighter than the Torvani homeworld's 1.4. Atmosphere: standard mix with elevated particulates, which was just Korath Prime being Korath Prime. She laced her boots, checked the tie on her left wrist where the display sat, and walked to Etha 3. The training complex was a converted mining shaft sunk 200 meters into the plateau basalt. The academy had repurposed it into a multi-level combat arena, open chambers connected by corridors of varying width and height, some flooded with ankle-deep mineral runoff, some narrowed to single-file passages, some opening into cathedral-sized vaults where the ceiling disappeared into dark. Hard light projectors lined every surface, capable of generating opponents, obstacles, and environmental effects that hit with real kinetic force. The system calibrated in real time, adjusting difficulty based on biometric data streamed from the cadets' uniform sensors. Kira entered at 5:58, 2 minutes early. The staging area was a bare chamber with a single console displaying her name, her species classification, and her projected performance band, Tier 4. The Torvani system ranked incoming cadets on a 5-tier scale based on species physiology, prior training data, and institutional history. Tier 1 was elite, reserved for Torvani cadets from military lineages with generational records. Tier 5 was remedial. Tier 4 meant the system expected her to survive the evaluation without distinguishing herself. It meant the system expected nothing. The console chimed. Cadet Vasquez, combat evaluation begins in 60 seconds. You will face a series of opponents calibrated to your species profile. The sequence will escalate. Your score is cumulative. There is no passing threshold for Phase 1. She stepped into the arena. The first opponent materialized 6 meters ahead, a hard light construct modeled on a standard Torvani combat drone, bipedal, armored, fast. It rushed her with the straight-line aggression the simulation used for opening calibration. Kira sidestepped, dropped her center of gravity, and swept its lead leg at the ankle joint. The construct stumbled. She drove her elbow into its neck housing and it deactivated, flickering out in a burst of amber light. 7 seconds. The system recalculated. The second opponent was faster, heavier, with a modified attack pattern that included feints. It came from her left, probing. She let it close, read the feint. The lead shoulder dipped before the real strike, a tell that the simulation's algorithm had not bothered to mask, because the algorithm expected a Tier 4 cadet to flinch at the feint and leave her center open. She did not flinch. She blocked the strike with her forearm, felt the kinetic impact ring through her radius bone, and countered with a palm strike to the construct's sensor array. It staggered. She kicked it in the chest with the flat of her boot, and it hit the wall and died. 11 seconds. The third was a pair, 2 constructs coordinated attacking from opposing angles. Kira backed toward the wall, eliminating one angle, and took the first construct's charge on her hip, redirecting it into its partner. Both stumbled. She finished the standing one with a knee to its midsection, and stamped the fallen one's shoulder joint until it deactivated. The system recalculated again. She felt the shift, a subtle change in the hard light projector's hum, a recalibration that meant the algorithm was pulling from a higher difficulty band than her species profile warranted. Good. The fourth opponent was not a drone. It was a hard light replica of a Torvani sparring partner, 8 feet tall, armored, with the reach advantage and mass advantage that the species carried into every physical engagement. It moved with the deliberate economy of a trained fighter, not the algorithmic aggression of a test construct. This was what the system sent when it wanted to see what happened when a cadet faced something genuinely larger, faster, and stronger. Kira circled. The Torvani replica watched her with the sensor analogs of eyes, tracking her movement with a patience that unnerved most cadets because it mirrored the real Torvani combat style: wait, assess, strike once, end it. The replica's jaw plates were sealed. It was calibrated for lethality. She moved first, not because she had an opening, but because waiting against a Torvani was a losing game. They were patient in a way that humans were not evolved to match. She feinted right, changed direction, and drove in low, under the replica's guard, targeting the inner thigh where Torvani armor plating thinned to allow joint articulation. Her fist connected. The replica's leg buckled. She was already moving, rolling clear of the counterswing that whistled past her shoulder with enough kinetic force to crack ribs, coming up behind the construct and hammering the base of its skull housing with both fists clasped together. The replica went down. It deactivated face down on the stone floor, and the system logged her time and recalculated her tier projection. The fifth opponent materialized before the fourth had fully dissolved. The system had stopped waiting between rounds, testing whether the reduced recovery window would degrade her performance. It was a Drekari replica, low and fast, with clawed appendages that slashed in tight arcs designed to overwhelm a defender's tracking ability. She had sparred against Drekari cadets in Week 6. They fought like cutting tools, all edges, all speed, no wasted motion. The replica came at her in a weaving approach, claws cycling through 3 attack lines simultaneously. Kira did not try to block all 3. She picked the center line, stepped into it, absorbed the hit on her left forearm, feeling the hardened light carve a line of fire across her skin, and drove her right hand into the gap the committed attack had opened. Her palm connected with the construct's chest plate. It was not a powerful strike by Torvani standards. It did not need to be. She had hit the resonance point where the hard light matrix was thinnest, the structural compromise that let the construct move fluidly. The chest plate cracked. The construct froze, then deactivated. She had found the seam, not through analysis, not through a database readout, but through the accumulated feedback of 5 fights, the way each construct moved, the way each construct's light flickered at stress points, the way the hard light matrices hummed at slightly different frequencies depending on their structural integrity. She was reading the simulation's physics the way a farrier reads a horse's gait, through feel, through pattern, through the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands before it reaches the brain. In the observation gallery above Ether 3, the combat evaluation feeds played on a bank of 12 monitors. Each monitor showed a different cadet session. Instructor Dave stood at the central console, his massive arms crossed, his jaw plates ground shut, watching the feeds with the impassive efficiency of someone who had observed 10,000 cadets grind through this evaluation. Next to him, Sub-Instructor Relin, a younger Torvani with lighter plating, and the nervous energy of an officer who had not yet learned to keep still, monitored the biometric readouts. Vasquez is in the 4th tier, Relin said. Her species profile. I can read the profile, Dave said. On the monitor, the human was fighting her 8th opponent. The system had promoted her to the difficulty band typically reserved for Tier 2 cadets. She was bleeding from a cut above her left eye where a construct had caught her with a glancing strike, and the blood ran down the side of her face in a thin red line that she wiped with her sleeve without pausing. She had not slowed down. The constructs were coming faster now, harder, and the system's recalibration algorithm was struggling with a problem it had not been designed for. The human's performance curve was not following the expected arc. Every species in the system's database showed a characteristic arc during the combat evaluation. Torvani cadets started strong and maintained, a flat line of consistent output, reliable and predictable. Drekari cadets started fast and spiked, burning through opponents with explosive speed before fatigue degraded their performance. Solen cadets started cautiously, built slowly, and peaked late if they peaked at all. The system expected the human to follow the Drekari curve, A Category 7 Deathworld species should spike and fade. Kira Vasquez was not spiking. She was not fading. She was climbing. Each opponent fell faster than the last, not because she was getting stronger but because she was learning. Every construct taught her something about the simulation's patterns, and she folded each lesson into her movement with a speed that the algorithm could not model, because the algorithm had no data on human adaptive combat learning. She was reading the system the way a mechanic reads an engine, listening for the knocks, identifying the tolerances, adjusting her approach with each cycle. By the 10th opponent, the system had promoted her to the Tier 1 difficulty band, and Rellen's biometric readout showed something that made his plating click involuntarily. "Her cortisol is dropping," he said. Dave looked at the readout. The Torvani instructor did not click. He did not shift his weight. He read the numbers with the same flat attention he gave everything, and then he returned his gaze to the monitor where the human was dismantling a Tier 1 combat construct with an efficiency that bordered on mechanical. Human cortisol was a stress hormone. It was supposed to spike under sustained physical threat and remain elevated as long as the threat persisted. Every species in the database showed elevated stress markers during the combat evaluation, the expected physiological cost of sustained mortal threat simulation. The human's cortisol had peaked during Opponent 3 and had been declining steadily since Opponent 5. Her heart rate had stabilized at 142 beats per minute, which the system flagged as elevated but sustainable. Her breathing pattern had locked into a rhythm that the biometric array classified as trained respiratory regulation. She was not getting more stressed, she was getting more comfortable. The session ended at 11:47, 13 minutes early. The system ran out of pre-programmed difficulty bands and defaulted to a standby screen that read, "Evaluation parameters exceeded, manual review required." Kira stood in the center of the arena, breathing hard, bleeding from 3 separate cuts, her knuckles raw and starting to swell, and she looked up at the observation gallery. She could not see through the one-way panels, but she looked anyway, and the expression on her face was not triumph or defiance or exhaustion. It was a question. Specifically, it was the question that every human asked after they had done what was required and found it insufficient. Is that all? Dave watched her look up. He did not answer the question. Phase 2 began at 1400 without rest. The cadets were divided into fire teams of 4 and dropped into a tactical scenario that the Academy called the Labyrinth, a shifting, hard-light maze of corridors, dead ends, and threat pockets that required the team to navigate from an entry point to an extraction beacon in under 3 hours. The maze reconfigured every 20 minutes. The threat pockets contained opponents that could only be neutralized by coordinated action, 2 or more cadets attacking simultaneously from different angles. Solo operators failed. The labyrinth was designed to test teamwork, communication, and the ability to trust someone whose biology you did not understand. Kira was assigned to Fire Team 12. Her teammates were Thesson, a Drekari cadet with mottled green scales and a nervous habit of clicking his Duklo against the floor; Uli, a Solen whose circulatory glow had dimmed to a pale, exhausted chartreuse after the morning's combat evaluation; and Mar, a Torvani cadet who outmassed Kira by a factor of 3, and who looked at her when the team assignments posted with an expression that did not require translation. "Why is the small one on my team?" Kira looked back at him. She did not explain herself. She did not introduce herself. She said, "I'll take point." Mar's jaw plates shifted. Among the Torvani, point position in a fire team was given to the most expendable member, because the point walked into the unknown first and absorbed whatever the unknown contained. Kira knew this. She had read the Torvani Tactical Doctrine Manual. She was volunteering to be expendable. "Fine," Mar said. The labyrinth opened at 14:05. Kira entered first. The first corridor was narrow, wide enough for a Torvani to pass single file, which meant Kira had room to move. The walls were hard light, translucent and faintly blue, with a shimmer that made depth perception unreliable. She moved with her hands slightly extended, fingers brushing the wall surfaces to confirm distance, the way she had learned to navigate darkened hallways in her grandfather's farmhouse during the power outages that hit the valley every winter. Touch was more reliable than vision in unfamiliar architecture. Her body knew this before her mind did. 20 meters in, the first threat pocket. Two constructs appeared simultaneously at opposite ends of a junction. Kira dropped flat. Mar, coming up behind her, saw the movement and stopped. Thesson scrambled to the wall. Uli froze, his glow brightening involuntarily, a Solen stress response that functioned like a beacon in the dim corridor. Uli dim, Kira said. It was not a command. It was the tone of voice a person uses when they are pointing out something obvious to someone they assume is competent. Uli dimmed. The Solen had no voluntary control over their bioluminescence, but the suggestion seemed to trigger a conscious override stress management through external direction. His glow faded to a low amber. Mar right junction, Thesson left with me, on my mark. Mar did not argue. There was no time to argue. The constructs were advancing. Kira launched from the floor toward the left junction with Thesson half a step behind. The Drekari was fast, faster than Kira in a straight sprint, and he hit the construct at the same instant she did, his claws raking the construct's shoulder housing while Kira drove her boot into its knee joint. It folded. Across the junction, Mar had simply walked through the right side construct, absorbing its kinetic strike against his chest plating and crushing it against the wall with one arm. The Torvani method, absorb and destroy, efficient if you had the mass for it. They moved on. Kira called the turns. She called them not because she was the designated leader. Fireteam authority at Korath Prime defaulted to the senior cadet, which was Mar, but because she was faster at reading the maze's logic than anyone else on the team. The labyrinth reconfigured on 20-minute cycles, but the reconfiguration was not random. It followed structural rules. Load-bearing walls stayed, connector corridors rotated, dead ends shifted but maintained consistent density. After the first reconfiguration, Kira had identified the pattern. After the second, she was predicting which corridors would open and which would seal before the shift happened. Mar noticed. He did not comment, but he started following her turns without hesitation, which was a Torvani concession that meant more than any verbal acknowledgement. At the 40-minute mark, the labyrinth introduced a new variable: gas. A pale green aerosol began seeping from vents at floor level, a sensory irritant calibrated to each species' vulnerability threshold. For Torvani, it targeted the subsonic vibration channels in their jaw plates, filling the air with a dissonant frequency that degraded their spatial awareness. For Drekari, it was a thermal compound that heated their scales and triggered premature shedding stress. For Solen, it was photoreactive, particles that attached to their circulatory glow and created a feedback loop of increasing brightness, making them visible targets. For humans, it was a simple lacrimator, tear gas. Kira's eyes watered, her throat constricted, her sinuses burned with a familiar wretched fire that she recognized from the time her older cousin had set off a canister of pepper spray in the garage on a dare, and from the Academy's own chemical exposure drill in Week 8, which the Torvani instructors had used to establish baseline responses for each species. The Torvani response was disorientation. The Drekari response was agitation. The Solen response was panic. The human response, which the Academy's chemical database listed as lacrimation, mild respiratory distress, temporary visual impairment, was exactly what it said on the file. Kira's eyes teared up. She blinked the tears free, breath through her mouth, and kept moving. The gas was unpleasant. It was not disabling. She had once spent 3 hours pulling fence wire in a field where the neighbor was burning brush, and the smoke had been worse. Uli, close your vents, she said over her shoulder. Thesson, drop your visor if you have one. Mar, can you still hear me? Mars' jaw plates were vibrating. The subsonic interference was worse than the visual. He shook his head once, a massive, slow-motion gesture that meant his spatial processing was degraded. "Reduced function," he said. The words came out slightly slurred, the Torvani equivalent of speaking through cotton. "Stay on my shoulder. Follow my hand signals. Left means left, right means right, fist means stop. We keep moving." She led them through the gas. Her eyes streamed. She navigated by touch and memory, running her fingertips along the walls, counting steps, tracking the turns she had predicted before the gas dropped. The maze reconfigured around them at the 50-minute mark, and 3 of her predicted routes held. 2 did not. She adjusted, backtracked 7 meters, and found the connector she needed by feel. They hit the extraction beacon at the 2-hour and 12-minute mark. First team in. Thesson was bleeding from a gash along his jaw ridge where a construct had caught him, and Uli was dim and shaking with exhaustion, and Mars' chest plating had a hairline fracture from absorbing 3 consecutive heavy strikes. Kira's knuckles were swollen to twice their normal size, and her left ankle was tender where she had turned it on a wet corridor surface, and none of these things showed on her face. She stood at the beacon and waited for the system to log their time and the observation gallery to record their arrival. In the gallery, Relin pulled up Fire Team 12's tactical overlay. The team's movement pattern was displayed as a colored trace on a maze schematic: blue for Mar, green for Thesson, yellow for Uli, red for the human. The red line was always in front. It was always the first to enter a junction, the first to identify a threat, the first to call a directional change. The red line moved through the maze the way water moved through a watershed, finding the path of least resistance before anyone else saw that the path existed. "She took point," Relin said. Dave was watching the live feed of Fireteam 12 at the extraction beacon. The human was sitting on a supply crate, wrapping her swollen knuckles with a strip of medical adhesive she had torn from a first aid kit mounted on the beacon post. She was not grimacing. She was not cradling her hands. She was wrapping them the way someone wraps a tool handle: maintenance, not treatment. "She took point and the team came in first," Dave said. He did not inflect the sentence. It was a fact placed on the table like a document. Phase 3 began at 200 the following morning. No warning. The barracks lights slammed to full spectrum at a frequency that the Torvani sleep biology interpreted as emergency dawn, a stimulus designed to trigger maximum alertness in the shortest possible time. The Torvani cadets were on their feet in 3 seconds, armor plates locked, jaw mechanisms sealed. The Solen took longer, their cocoons dissolving slowly, their dimmed circulatory systems struggling to ramp back to operational glow. The Drekari dropped from their racks in combat posture, scaled bodies coiled and ready. Kira sat up. She had been sleeping lightly, the human body's default in hostile environments, a legacy of 1,000,000 years of sleeping in places where something might eat you. Her heart rate went from resting to operational in 4 seconds. She was dressed and booted in under a minute. Not because she was fast, but because she had slept with her boots untied beside her rack and her uniform sealed to the throat. A habit she had developed in week 3 when the academy had run a surprise drill at 3:15, and she had lost 40 seconds fumbling with closures in the dark. The assignment was simple: get to the summit of Ridge 7, a volcanic escarpment 14 kilometers from the academy, rising 900 meters above the plateau floor before 800. No transport, no provisions, no communication, no weapons, just the uniform you were wearing and whatever your body could do. The cadets filed out of the barracks into the copperdark of Koreth Prime's pre-dawn. The sulfur haze was thicker at night, and the air tasted like licking a battery terminal. Temperature, 4 degrees Celsius. The Solen cadets began shivering immediately, their translucent skin dimming as their circulatory systems diverted energy to thermal regulation. The Drekari hunched their shoulders, scales tightening against the cold. The Torvani walked into it like it was room temperature, because for a species that evolved on a world where winter meant -30, and the air was 40% denser, 4 degrees and thin atmosphere was practically tropical. Kira zipped her collar to her chin, tucked her hands into her sleeves, and started walking. 4 degrees was a November morning in the Central Valley. She had done chores in less. The terrain between the Academy and Ridge 7 was volcanic, loose scoria, basalt flows, and sulfur-crusted drainage channels that looked solid and weren't. The ground shifted underfoot with every step. Torvani cadets powered through en masse and wide-set feet. Drekari cadets scrambled with their low centers of gravity and clawed toes. Solen cadets struggled, their thin limbs designed for the smooth surfaces of their homeworld's crystalline cities, not the ankle-breaking chaos of volcanic rubble. Kira moved at a steady pace. Not fast, not showy. The pace of someone who knew that 14 kilometers on bad terrain was not a sprint but a rhythm problem, and that the body that won was the body that found its gear and held it. She had learned to walk long distances before she had learned to ride a bicycle. Her grandfather's property was 4 miles from the nearest paved road, and if you wanted to get anywhere, you walked, and if you complained about walking, you still walked, and eventually you stopped complaining and the walking became something your legs did without consulting your brain. By kilometer 6, the field had begun to sort itself. The Torvani cadets led in a tight group, their heavy bodies eating ground with each step. The Drekari were spread out behind them, some moving well, some flagging as the cold stiffened their scales. The Solen had fallen to the back of the pack, several of them visibly struggling, their glow pulsing in the distressed patterns that meant their bodies were beginning to prioritize survival over performance. Kira was in the middle. She was not at the front because her stride length was half a Torvani's and her mass was a third of a Drekari's, and simple biomechanics put her at a disadvantage on flat terrain. But she was not falling back either. She was holding position, her pace unchanging, her breathing locked into the 4-count rhythm she had used on every long hike since she was 12 years old. Inhale for 4 steps, hold for 2, exhale for 4, hold for 2. It was not sophisticated. It was not a technique she had learned at any training facility. It was something her body had figured out on the fire roads above the valley, carrying a 20-pound pack in August heat, and it worked because it gave the diaphragm a pattern, and the pattern gave the mind a rail to run on, and the mind on a rail did not wander into the territory of pain or doubt, or the seductive question of whether stopping would really be so bad. She did not stop. At kilometer 9, the terrain tilted upward. Ridge 7 rose out of the plateau like a wall, dark basalt laced with yellow sulfur deposits, the face steep enough in places to require hands. The Torvani cadets attacked the slope with brute force, their heavy bodies slamming into the grade, their armored hands gripping basalt with a strength that cracked the rock surface. 2 of them slipped and recovered. One lost 20 meters of elevation to a scoria slide and had to reclimb. The Drekari used their claws, driving them into cracks and hauling themselves up with a scrambling efficiency that was fast but unsustainable. Their cold-stiffened muscles were beginning to cramp, and 2 of them stopped to rest on a ledge at the 600-meter mark. Kira climbed the way she had climbed the granite faces above Lake Isabella when she was 16, 3 points of contact at all times, testing each hold before committing weight, finding the root with her eyes before her hands reached for it. She was slower than the Torvani. She was slower than the Drekari. But she did not slip, and she did not stop, and she did not rest, because the human body had a gear that other species did not appear to possess. A gear below sprint and above walk, a sustainable output level that could be maintained for hours without significant degradation, the evolutionary inheritance of a persistence predator that had once chased antelope across the Serengeti until the antelope's legs gave out. She summited Ridge 7 at 7:14, 46 minutes before the deadline. She was not the first. 7 Torvani cadets had arrived before her, their massive bodies arrayed along the summit ridge like statues, breathing steadily, barely winded. 2 Drekari had made it, both of them curled against rocks to conserve heat, their scales rattling in the cold wind. But she was 10th out of 54, and when the system logged her arrival time and cross-referenced it with her species profile, Tier 4, projected to arrive between 7:45 and 7:55, if she arrived at all. The projection note updated for the second time in 18 hours. Performance outside modeled parameters. Kira sat on the summit. The wind cut through her uniform and the sulfur haze burned the back of her throat, and her hands were raw from the basalt, and her left ankle throbbed with a steady, patient ache that she filed under the category of things that hurt but did not matter. She looked out over the plateau, where the remaining cadets were still climbing, small figures on the dark rock face, some moving steadily, some stopped, some beginning the slow descent that meant they had quit. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel vindication. She felt the particular kind of quiet that came after sustained effort when the effort had been sufficient, and the body knew it, a stillness that was not rest but resolution, the organism settling into the knowledge that it had done what was asked and had not broken. Below her on the ridge face, a Solen cadet had stopped moving. Kira could see the faint glow, pulsing yellow-white, the color of distress, about 200 meters below the summit. The cadet was clinging to a narrow ledge, not climbing, not descending, just holding on. The wind was stronger at that elevation, and the Solen body, thin, light, evolved for temperate interiors, was shaking visibly even from this distance. Kira looked at the summit timer. 7:18. 42 minutes remained. The summit protocol was clear. Once you arrived, you stayed. You did not descend. You did not assist. The crucible was an individual evaluation. She stood up and started climbing back down. Mar, the Torvani from her fire team, watched her go. His jaw plates shifted once, the Torvani expression that could mean surprise, confusion, or the specific kind of recalculation that happened when data contradicted a model. Kira reached the Solen cadet in 6 minutes. It was Uli, her teammate from the labyrinth, the one whose glow she had told to dim. He was pressed against the ledge face, his translucent fingers locked into a crack in the basalt, his entire body trembling with a frequency that suggested his circulatory system was approaching thermal shutdown. His glow was barely visible, a faint amber pulse that weakened with each cycle. Uli. His head turned, his eyes large, dark, adapted for the diffuse light of his homeworld's crystal forests, focused on her with difficulty. Vasquez, you summited. I did. Can you move? My thermal regulation is failing. The cold, I cannot. His fingers slipped. One hand came free of the crack and he swung sideways, held by the other hand alone, his thin body dangling over a 100-meter drop. The sound he made was not a scream. Solen did not scream. It was a frequency shift in his glow, a sudden, brilliant flash of white that meant terror in a language that was not sound. Kira grabbed his wrist. Human grip strength, 65 kilograms of sustained force from a hand evolved to hold tools, throw rocks, and hang from branches, locked around the Solen's thin forearm like a vice. She hauled him back to the ledge, braced her boots against a basalt ridge, and held him against the rock face with her own body, pressing her warmth into his trembling frame. Human body temperature, 37 degrees Celsius. A furnace. A biological reactor that burned constantly, cycling oxygen and glucose into a heat output that most galactic species found uncomfortable at close range. Against Uli's failing thermal system, it was a radiator. His shaking slowed. His glow stabilized, amber deepening toward a steady yellow-green. She felt him stop trembling, felt his circulatory system catch and hold, and she kept holding him against the rock because letting go before his grip came back would kill him, and she was not going to let that happen. Can you climb? She asked after 3 minutes. Yes, I think. Then climb, I'm behind you. They ascended together. Uli climbed slowly, his fingers finding holds with the cautious precision of someone who had nearly died and was not yet finished processing that fact. Kira climbed behind him, one hand always within reach of his body, ready to catch, ready to hold, ready to do the thing that the crucible protocol said she should not do and that every cell in her body said she must. They summited at 7:41, 19 minutes to spare. In the observation gallery, Dave watched the replay of the human descending the ridge. He watched it twice. The biometric data showed her cortisol spike when she grabbed the Solen's wrist, the first genuine stress response the system had recorded from her since Phase 1, and then drop immediately afterward, replaced by the steady, locked-in physiological pattern that the system had begun to label, for lack of a better term, as human operational mode. She had violated summit protocol. She had descended after arrival. She had assisted another cadet in an individual evaluation. By the letter of the Crucible's rules, she should be docked points, possibly enough to fail her. Dave pulled up her cumulative score. Phase 1 Combat Evaluation, Tier 1 Equivalent. Phase 2 Labyrinth, First Team Point Operator. Phase 3 Endurance March, 10th Arrival inside the top 20%. And now a protocol violation that, by the same system's scoring matrix, would cost her 12% of her Phase 3 points. He looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he opened the scoring override panel, a tool that senior instructors were authorized to use once per crucible cycle, for exactly one cadet, under exactly one condition. When the evaluation system's output contradicted the instructor's professional judgment of a cadet's fitness for command. He did not override the penalty. He did not need to. What he did was add a notation to her file, in the field reserved for the subjective metric he had mentioned on the parade deck, the metric called composure under sustained pressure. The notation read, Cadet Vasquez maintains function, maintains judgment, maintains cohort, recommend reclassification, Tier 1. The final 20 hours were a continuous tactical exercise. No sleep, no rest, no structured phases, just a rolling series of problems dropped on the surviving cadets in unpredictable intervals. A hostage extraction scenario at hour 50. A communications blackout navigation problem at hour 54. A casualty triage exercise at hour 58 that required cadets to assess simulated injuries on species whose anatomy they had studied in the classroom but never touched. Kira worked through them. She worked through them the way she had worked through everything at Korath Prime, steadily, without complaint, without the dramatic competence displays that the Torvani respected or the explosive bursts that the Drekari admired. She just kept going. When other cadets stopped to rest, she rested standing up, her eyes still open, her hands still ready. When the problems came, she solved them or she contributed to solving them, and when she could not solve them, she said so and listened to whoever could. At hour 60, the system presented her fire team with a communications array that had been disabled by simulated enemy action. The exercise required the team to restore the array using components salvaged from a damaged supply crate. The components were labeled in Torvani technical notation. The assembly sequence required fine motor manipulation of connectors designed for three-fingered Torvani hands. Mar looked at the components. Thesson looked at the components. Uli, whose technical scores were the highest on the team, looked at the components and said, the sequence requires a simultaneous two-point pressure hold on connectors G7 and G12 while rotating the coupling sleeve. I can identify the sequence, but I cannot execute it. My hands are too thin. Mar looked at his own hands, 3 fingers each as thick as Kira's wrist, too wide. Thesson clicked his Duklo. My claws would puncture the sleeve. Kira picked up the coupling sleeve. It was designed for Torvani hands, which meant it was too large for hers, but the two-point pressure hold required hitting 2 nodes simultaneously at a distance of 8 centimeters, and her human hands, with their 5 independent fingers and their precision grip that could thread a needle or pick a lock or hold a pen and write a letter, could reach both nodes at once if she stretched her thumb and ring finger to their full span. She held the pressure, rotated the sleeve, felt the connector seat with a click that vibrated through her palm. The array came online. The system logged the repair time, 4 minutes 11 seconds, fastest in the cohort. Uli looked at her hands, looked at the connector, looked at her hands again. You have, those are, how many joints do those digits have? 3 per finger, 2 in the thumb. That is excessive. Yeah, Kira said, we think so too. At hour 66, 6 hours before the end, the crucible offered its final surprise. The fire teams were dissolved and reconstituted into mixed units of 8, 2 members drawn from each of the 4 largest species cohorts. Kira found herself in a unit with Mar and 1 other Torvani, 2 Drekari she did not know, 2 Solen, and a second human. There was no second human. There had never been a second human at Korath Prime. The 8th member of the unit was a hard-light construct wearing a human face. It was modeled on a generic Terran male, built from the same database that had classified her as Tier 4, and it moved with the slightly wrong gait of a system that understood human biomechanics from data but not from experience. Its face was placid. Its responses were algorithmically correct. It was, in every measurable way, a simulation of the thing Kira was. The exercise was a command scenario. The unit had to organize a defensive perimeter around a simulated supply point while managing incoming threats from 3 directions. The construct human was assigned to Kira's sector. It followed her instructions. It executed competently. It performed at the level the database predicted a human would perform. It was not enough. At the 20-minute mark, the threat from the eastern corridor escalated beyond the construct's parameters. 2 heavy opponents, Tier 1 class, hit the sector simultaneously. The construct human responded according to its programming. It engaged the first opponent and held position, trading kinetic strikes in an exchange pattern that was efficient but rigid. It did not adapt. It did not improvise. When the second opponent flanked it, the construct did not feel the threat coming, because feeling was not something the database could encode. Kira hit the flanking opponent from the side, driving it off the construct's blind spot with a sliding kick that caught its leading leg and dumped it onto the corridor floor. She pinned it with her boot, deactivated it with a strike to the resonance point she had learned in Phase 1, and turned back to find the construct human already deactivated. The first opponent had found its pattern, exploited it, and ended it in 3 moves. The system logged the construct's termination and did not replace it. Kira held the eastern sector alone for the remaining 40 minutes of the exercise, managing a 2-corridor defense that the scenario had designed for 2 operators. She did not have the mass of a Torvani or the speed of a Drekari. She had footwork, positioning, and the particular human talent for making a small space very expensive to enter. In the gallery, Relin noted the construct's failure. The simulation model was outperformed by the live subject in every metric. The algorithm's projection of human capability was insufficient, Dave said. It was the first time Relin had heard the senior instructor use a word that acknowledged a flaw in the Academy's systems. The crucible ended at 600 on the 3rd day. 54 cadets had entered. 41 remained standing in formation on the parade deck, blinking in the copper light of Korath Prime's dawn, wearing uniforms that were torn and stained and soaked with 3 days of sweat and mineral dust. 13 had been pulled by injury, by exhaustion, by the quiet, private decision to stop walking and sit down, and accept that the crucible had found the bottom of what they had. 3 of the 13 were Solen. 2 were Drekari. 8 were Torvani, which Kira noted silently because it was the first time in the Academy's modern history that more Torvani had washed out of the crucible than any other single species. Dave stood before them. He was unchanged. The same posture, the same sealed jaw, the same voice that hit the chest before the ears. If he had slept during the 72 hours, Kira could not tell, If the results surprised him, she could not tell that either. His face was a wall of calcium and cartilage and professional inscrutability. 41, he said. You survived. You did not finish. Nobody finishes the crucible. The crucible finishes you, and what is left is what we work with. He walked the line, stopped at each cadet, said nothing to most of them. To a Torvani heavy cadet who had carried a fallen Drekari for the last 3 kilometers of the endurance march, he said, "Noted." To Thesson, who had lost a strip of scales from his jaw to a construct strike and had not stopped to check the wound, he said, "Noted." To Mar, whose chest plating now had 3 fracture lines and who stood at attention as though none of them existed, he said, "Noted." He stopped in front of Kira. She stood at attention, 5'6", 138 pounds, swollen hands wrapped in medical adhesive that was peeling at the edges, a cut above her left eye that had scabbed over and reopened and scabbed again. Boots that she had filed down and worn through in 3 days, and that were now held together by stubbornness and the friction of her socks against the interior lining. Her face was level. Her eyes were steady. She was tired in a way that went past muscle and bone and into the architecture of her nervous system. But the tiredness did not show because she had been tired before, many times in many places, and she had learned that the face you showed the world when you were tired was the face the world would remember. Dave looked at her. The Torvani instructor's sensory apparatus registered everything: her temperature, her cortisol, her heart rate, the micro tremors in her hands, the exact degree of fatigue in her postural muscles. He could read her body the way she read a maze. And what he read, standing in front of a human who weighed less than his left arm and who had walked through 72 hours of a curriculum designed for species twice her size, was the same thing the combat evaluation system had labeled, and the labyrinth overlay had traced, and the biometric array had recorded, and the Ridge Protocol violation had demonstrated. She maintained. That was the word, not excelled, not dominated, not broke every record in the system. She maintained, through pain and cold and exhaustion and the systematic pressure of an institution that had not been built for her body or her biology or her way of thinking. She maintained function. She maintained judgment. She maintained her people. And she had done it at a level that the system could not model because the system had never seen it, because no human had ever walked through the crucible before, and the data did not exist. The data existed now. "Cadet Vasquez," Dave said. "Sir." "Your file arrived 14 weeks ago, classified Tier 4. The system projected that you would wash out during Phase 1. He paused. "The system projected incorrectly." Kira said nothing. There was nothing to say. "Your crucible score will be posted with the cohort. Your tier classification has been updated." He held her gaze for 1 full second, a long time for a Torvani who communicated precision through brevity. "Tier 1. He moved on. The formation continued. The copper sky brightened over the plateau, and the sulfur haze caught the light and scattered it into something that almost resembled warmth. Kira Vasquez stood in line with 40 other cadets who had survived a thing that was designed to break them, and she did not smile, and she did not weep, and she did not look at the sky or the ridge or the other cadets or the instructors retreating back. She looked straight ahead, into the middle distance where the volcanic plain met the horizon, and she breathed. 4 counts in, hold for 2, 4 counts out, hold for 2. The crucible was over. Korath Prime was not. The next 14 weeks would be harder, because now the institution knew what she was and would calibrate accordingly, and the calibration would not be kind. She knew this the way she knew the weight of a pack, or the temperature of a November morning, or the feel of basalt under filed-down boots, in her body, where knowledge lived before it reached the mind. She stood, she breathed, she waited for what came next. In the observation gallery, after the formation dismissed, Relin pulled up the cohort's final crucible data and began the standard post-evaluation report. He reached the entry for Cadet Vasquez, Tier 1 reclassified and paused. "Do I flag the summit protocol violation?" he asked. Dave was already at the door, his massive body filling the frame, his back to the gallery's monitors. He stopped. "Leave it in the file," he said, "and add a note that the Terran Integration Compact should be contacted regarding expanded enrollment." Rellen's plating clicked. "How many seats?" Dave did not turn around. His voice was the same flat instrument it always was, a tool for conveying information, not feeling, but somewhere beneath the calcium and the cartilage and the 200 years of institutional certainty, something had shifted. Something small. Something that the biometric array could not have measured if it had been pointed at him, because it was not a change in cortisol or heart rate or postural tension. It was a recalibration. The quiet, internal acknowledgement of a data point that required the model to be rewritten. "Start with 4, he said, and walked out into the copper light of Korath Prime.